Alright, so this video is to cover how to get the best video possible out of your 04 Air Unit Pro and the kind of camera settings you want to use, also the ND filters. I'll have a separate video on the 04 Standard or the 04 Lite a little bit later. I'm not sure when or if I'm going to get ND filters for those. So I'm recording my screen here, and we'll look at the settings in the goggles. I'll have the everything powered up here. You're seeing the camera view. And obviously you want to do this outside in the proper lighting settings, but obviously I want to do this on the bench so that I can record all this stuff. So, all right, so first the camera settings. You want to go over here and go down to settings and go to camera. And first off, let's make sure that we're not in race mode. Let me get out of that here. Let's go to transmission. Okay, so race mode's off. Go back to settings, go to camera. I prefer to be in the 4x3 mode. Oh, by the way, this is just the way I like to do things. It's very subjective. There's no real right or wrong way of doing things. Obviously, there's things like the 180-degree shutter rule. That's mostly for people that are in photography, not for people flying FPV, in my opinion. Of course, there are people that like to stick to that as a hard rule. I don't necessarily. But we'll talk about that here in a second. Anyway, this is what I fly, 4x3 mode in 4K 60. Now you can, of course, change that to 4K 30 is probably for lower light situations. But typically for daylight, 4K 60 will be fine. There's also 4K 48 if you want to convert that into 24 frames per second for those of you that like a little more cinematic look. But 4K 60 is what we'll stick with here. And then you want to record in the wide field of view. That's the only field of view that will capture the gyro data for gyro flow, which is what I recommend. Now, if you prefer to just use the built-in Rocksteady stabilization, you can go down here to recording stabilization and change that to Rocksteady. But then, of course, it won't record any gyro data, and you will not be able to stabilize the footage. You'll have to be basically stuck with Rocksteady. Now for me, ISO limit, I like to, I think the default 6400. I think 3200 is the max I would go for if you want the most noise-free video. And obviously lower is better if you're in really bright sunlight conditions. You could even reduce this down to as low as 800 or even 400 and probably get away with it if you're in really, really sunny conditions. So it really depends on what you want to do. All right, so then we'll go down to the advanced camera settings here. You want to be in the D-Log M for the color profile, which is the flat color profile. We'll talk about what you want to do in terms of color grading a little bit later in the video. Obviously, if you want to go for the normal color profile, it's only 8-bit color. It has built-in contrast and saturation that you can't adjust in post, or it makes it kind of harder. But the advantage of that is you don't have to do anything. You just get sort of a baked image. Generally looks pretty good for most people. If you want to just export to social media and stuff, it'll be fine. But if you want to, obviously you're here for getting the best video possible. You want to be in the D-Log M for the flat color profile. Now for me, on what I prefer sharpness set to -1. 0 is a little bit too sharp, but then I think going down to -2 is a little bit too much for the Pro. It's it gets a little bit, it looks like a kind of out of focus and maybe a little bit blurry. And then for the noise reduction, -1 seems to be good. You can kind of go to -2 if you really want to cut down on the noise reduction, sort of altering your image. If you feel like it's kind of changing the way it's supposed to look, then you can take it down to -2. And so those are all the main settings here in the main menu, but then you want to bring up the camera menu here. And obviously you want to switch out of auto mode into manual mode. And then you can then set your shutter and ISO. I typically like to set the shutter first. So if you want to follow the hard rule of the 180-degree shutter, then at a 60 FPS shutter, you're going to set your shutter speed to 1/120. That'll give you the 180-degree shutter. And then here you can see that the ISO is in auto mode. I typically like to leave it in auto mode because when you're flying around, you tend to fly sometimes into trees or under trees where it's darker, and then out in the sun where it's brighter. So you want a fixed shutter, but then you want to have your ISO adjustable. Now, going back to the shutter here, I personally don't follow the hard rule of the 180-degree shutter. I usually will go up a little bit higher, a little bit faster shutter, because I don't really like a lot of motion blur. I do like some, but I don't really like a lot of it. So I will sometimes go to 160 or 1/160 or 1/200, which is going to give you a brighter image. And you can use instead of using an ND64, you can go to the ND32. So it really depends on the lighting conditions outdoors. So in that case, if you go to 1/200 shutter here, then it's adjusting the ISO to 850. And that again, I would again leave it as basically as auto. Now again, if you want to go to, again, back to the hard and fast rules of the 180 shutter, everyone will go to 1/120, and then ISO, of course, you want the lowest ISO possible, and you can see here it's a pretty dark image without any ND filter. Now you can, based on just the current lighting conditions here on the bench, you can actually look here at the EV value here, and it's at negative 0.3. If you want a fixed ISO, now at 400 it was negative 0.3, at 800 it is 0.7, which is a little bit bright. So I don't have an ND filter on there right now, but if you want a fixed ISO, that's what you can do, and just try and get your EV as close to 0 as possible. I tend to like to underexpose versus overexpose, because when you can always recover shadows, but it's impossible to recover blown out highlights. All right, so with all that said, you want to have a fixed white balance. That's what I usually fly at, is 5000K. Again, kind of depends on kind of the look you're looking for. You can go a little bit cooler or warmer, but 5000K would typically work for most situations. If you're in low light, you want to probably go down lower to like 4300K. Depends on, again, the lighting conditions. So you can adjust that as you see fit. But for me, for most situations, I will fly at 5000 Kelvin. And you want to have a fixed white balance, because if it's an auto white balance and it's adjusting as you're flying around, changing your angles to the sun, it looks really, for one, it doesn't look very good, and then it's really hard to correct in post-production. So that's really, really important to have a fixed white balance. And again here, aspect ratio 4:3, 4K 60, wide field of view. You can adjust your auto ISO limit there, and then again, recording stabilization off. You don't want rock steady on, because you want to do gyro flow, and then the D-Log M as your color profile. The color display assist is on by default, and that gives you, basically puts on a artificial LUT in the goggle view, so that you're not looking at a flat, low contrast image. If you would prefer a low contrast image for flying, some people do that. You can turn that off, and then you get a little bit less contrasty image. Some people prefer that. It doesn't really matter to me. I'm okay with either one. So in terms of which ND filter to use, that's going to depend on the lighting conditions that you have outside. This particular set from Freewell goes from ND8, 16, 32, and 64. Generally speaking, if you put on an ND64 and it's super bright out, you can adjust your, again, your other settings like your shutter and your ISO to get you an image around a 0 EV is what you're looking for. But it turns out that maybe it's not quite bright enough for an ND64 and it's too dark, then just drop it down to an ND32. Just make sure that your exposure, your EV value, isn't over or too bright. You don't want to go too much higher than like 0.7. Then you get a lot of blown out highlights. I would prefer something under 0 if you had a choice. And then so always go to a higher ND if possible, but not to the point where the image gets too dark. So that's how I would do it. I would go out, put them on, see your values you're getting there for your EV for those shutter values that you like, and then adjust the ND accordingly. Okay, so once you've recorded your footage and you've got it off the SD card, you're going to want to stabilize it in GyroFlow. I'll have another video that talks about that specifically. I'll link that down in the video description. You can follow those instructions. You can stabilize the video. You'll get a nice 4K file out of that one. and then you can then import it into your video editor to color grade it, because if you followed the instructions previously, you've recorded in the D-Log-M, which is the flat color profile, and you'll need to color grade it. Now, I don't know which video editor you're using. This is probably something you're going to have to look up on YouTube separately. There's a LUT file that you can get from DJI. It's made for the Avata 2. It'll work for this camera as well. It works perfectly fine. I'm showing you here what it looks like in Adobe Premiere, and it will look different if you're using another video editor. I don't have DaVinci Resolve or some of the other video editors for Apple. The process of importing a LUT and applying it to this footage is different for every video editor. So you'll have to do a little bit of a Google search or YouTube search to find how to apply that LUT to your footage. But basically what it does is it converts it from that flat color profile into the Rec 709 color profile, which is basically like gives you back all that contrast and saturation. And at that point you can kind of tweak it. You can add more, a little bit, take away a little bit, add more contrast, add more saturation if you want, or reduce it if you feel like that's too much. But that's generally what you want to do. So you want to import your footage, import the LUT, apply it to the footage. It will basically bring all the colors back, and then you can tweak it from there. There's lots of videos on how to do color grading on this kind of footage. So if you're looking for those kind of videos, I would suggest doing a YouTube search on Avata 2 or Action 4 color grading videos, especially the Action 4. The Action 4 is the same sensor as this one, and I did a quick YouTube search, and there was literally hundreds of videos on color grading Action 4 footage, because the LUT from DJI isn't the only LUT out there available for this camera. There's going to be lots of other LUTs out there. Obviously, a lot of them they cost money. Some of them are better than others. That's not my area of expertise, so I can't guide you in that sense, but there's a lot of options available out there for you. Now, again, of course, this is only one way of doing it. This is not necessarily the absolute best way of doing it. This is the way I like to do things. The footage here you may or may not like. It's kind of subjective. There's really no right answer. It kind of really depends on the look you want to go for, and you can kind of tweak the process to your particular requirements or needs. So hopefully this will give you some assistance in terms of figuring this out. It's kind of a little bit messy, but if you're looking for the best footage possible, this is sort of the process you have to go through to get that. So hopefully this video helped you out. If it did, let me know in the comments below, and I'll talk to you guys in the next video.